So we started back in part one, and if you are looking at this, please note that this is part two, so there's a part one to this. We started by talking about the format of the exam, and we talked about this idea that you're going to get a 50-mark question, and what your job is to do is to comment on the question more or less in the role of a consultant. But what is absolutely critical to all of this is that you must have some sense of structure. Students who are going to fail will begin to write, and as your mind does, it will naturally wander off on a train. Your answer then will come over as some sort of crazy Tom Sharp kind of novel where things go off at weird tangents. And there will be marks specifically for the presentation. So what we're going to do now is we're going to continue on with the same topics. Again, this idea is that we are giving you, or I am giving you, tools, and those tools that you have will enable you to answer the question in such a way that your answer has an appropriate structure to it. Okay? Right, in the first part, therefore, we looked at Michael Porter's 5 forces, we looked at environmental analysis, we looked at pests, and then we moved on later, again, Michael Porter came later on, and then we moved on as well to stakeholders, looking at who the stakeholders were, gave you an example of a cinema club that had been set up to show old-style films, but now we were getting more modern films to it because of revenue pressure. And then finally we looked at Mendelow. So now we're going to continue with this idea of stakeholders. So here on slide number 2, that we've headed this thing up as conflict resolution. But where you're going to see this in the exam, and where the examiners examined several times, is that we have this idea of identifying stakeholders. Now you will have conflicting stakeholders. So we've got this idea of we've got new customers who want these new films, which are Mad Max, Mission Impossible, The Minions, whatever. So very, very popular films, giving people more access to more showings, more choice for these modern films. And then you're going to have the older style of customers who are particularly coming to your theatre to watch Shakespeare, to watch opera. Right, for those of you who didn't watch part one, our scenario is that we have a theatre club, or a cinema rather, set up, and it's partly government funded, and it's partly government funded because it will show films which are limited interest films, for example Shakespeare, but the government wants to support culture. What's happening in that example is that the cinema club is losing money. The government are putting pressure on them to make themselves at least break even or more profitable to address their financial issues. To address their financial issues, what they're doing is they're showing modern popular films which are not culture. I mean, certainly, Minions and Mad Max is all coming from America, for example. So we've got now this conflict. To satisfy the financial needs, we're having to go more populist. So when we go more populist, we offend the people who are the purists. And so those people, also the purists, may include the management, they may include individuals in the government, they will certainly people like season ticket holders and the like of that. So now we've got this idea of conflict. And this is something that you can use in many of these old exam questions that have been set. So if you'll remember that from part one we talked about Mendelow and Mendelow's stakeholder mapping. Mendelow looked at two different factors. One was how much power people have, and the second one was how interested they are. So you get low, which is low power, low interest, which is, forgive me, but people you can more or less ignore. High, which is people with high power and high interest, and they're the people you're going to seek presumably to satisfy first. Then we have high power, low interest, and then low power but high interest. So we get these four groups. There will be, certainly amongst the interested parties, the high interest parties, there will be conflict. And I think the example that they give you in your textbooks for paper P5 is they show that customers, for example, in a computer company, want 24/7 within 2 minutes of calling, ability to talk to a human being who will give them advice on their computer. The employees want to work from 9 to 5. So you get a conflict there in terms of timing. And how do we resolve these kinds of timings? So here's conflict resolution amongst stakeholders. So the first one is prioritization. We simply prioritize what the issues are within a conflict. So whilst you may get people who are trying to demand that your cinema shows more and more Shakespeare, If 90% of the people want the minions, then you're going to go down to the level of the minions. So in terms of setting an exam question for an examiner, that's a nice way that you do your Mendelow mapping. Your Mendelow mapping, and then you start with your high highs, who are people with high influence, high power, and we prioritize their interests. So we prioritize certain things. Again, with areas with organizations which are government funded as well, your funding may well be dependent on you meeting certain goals and targets. So those things will be prioritized as well. So we get this idea of prioritization. Right, the next one is but just in terms of Mendelow's little matrix thing gives you a nice way to organize a priority. So your high highs, and then presumably after that you have to decide what comes first: high power, low interest, or high interest, low power. I suspect that high interest, low power may trump them if those people, especially if those people can form themselves into a group. Right, your next one down is negotiation, and this magical word that I've read for the first time, satisficing. Satisficing means that we just compromise. So what is the lowest level of compromise that people will actually accept? So we negotiate between the parties and say, when you want 24/7 on your computer, we'll give you 16 hours a day, but 8 hours it won't be on. And then the people themselves in the company have to work shift patterns to satisfy those 18. So we get this idea of negotiation between the people. Sequential attention here means therefore that we take one group of people and they get some attention now, with the understanding that therefore, so in this month we deal with employees issues, in the next month we'll deal with customer issues, in the third one we'll deal with shareholder issues, and there is this kind of, particularly here where time or money is a resource, so where time or money therefore is your limiting factor, we do them in order. So in January we have some money, so we spend it on the employees. February we have some money, so we spend it on improving the customer side. March we have some money, so it's improving shareholders' information systems. And you get this idea that your time or your money or whatever your limited resources are spent, but they're spent in order. And the people who get money spent on them in January understand they don't get anything until the next January. Again, the idea therefore is to put people in some form of a list or an order. Side payments mean it's this idea of horse trading. Okay, so you lose this. Look, guys, you have to work shift, but if you work shift, we'll increase your hourly payment, or we'll give you a couple of extra days holiday, or we'll close the office for a couple of days during the school holidays so you can spend some time with your kids. It's simply an idea that what's on the table, people give ground, but they're giving ground because off the table they're going to receive something else. And it's part of the negotiation. I mean, this is politics, pure and utter politics. Right, and the fifth one that you've got down there is exercise of power. So therefore, people who have power will simply exercise it. The government will say, we want this, and you say, well, let's talk about this, and they just go, no, there is no negotiation here, we will exercise our power. And so therefore, again, you have to look at the people with the power actually want, and again, an assessment of how likely they are to use that power. Right, that's your conflict resolution. There's a million and one of these little models like this, and I took this one because it's in your textbook, so your examiner has access to it, but do your best to try and remember those things. Where you'll see it in your exam with conflict resolution, it will be attached to stakeholders every time I've seen it in the past. So what we've moved on to in slide number 3 now is that we're moving away from this idea of stakeholder analysis, and we're moving up now to individual stakeholders. The stakeholder that you've got here in this, obviously in this slide, as you can see very clearly, is the role of the government. So how does the government fit into anything? Now, one of the great strengths of ACCA is this fact that ACCA is such a global certificate, and so we have people from all over the world. When you look at the Western Europe, Western Europe, America, the government plays very much this kind of role of like rule setting, and then people below carry on their trade. When you look at countries that I work in, like Russia, Ukraine, and places like that, you'll see that the government actually is 80 to 90% of the economy, and they're much more important. So with the role of the government here, I think you do have to remember that this is being set by an examiner who lives in Western Europe. So his mindset and his mentality is that the government will perform in such a way as you would expect to see in a government, in a country such as Great Britain. I wouldn't therefore bring into it, those extra things that you would expect to see in a country like Eastern Europe or China or somewhere. Therefore, taking that kind of perspective on it, you can see that the role of the government, therefore, is this kind of high-level regulatory role. We don't see very much about the government actually producing goods. We don't see about the government operating shops. High levels of privatization. So even with electricity and water and so on, consumers are still dealing with private organizations to all intents and purposes. If we look here at the role of the government, we see first of all that we have the legal, so consumer rights. Consumer rights in Western Europe vary very much from country to country. One of the big shocks for me about going to live in the United States of America was how little rights you actually have in terms of as a consumer. I remember I bought a computer. In fact, I bought a computer and my wife bought a computer on the same day. Needless to say, my wife told me that mine had to go back. So the thing hadn't even been taken out of the box. I sent it back. And the guy I sent it back to tried very, very hard to refuse to pay for it, he said it had been damaged or something, which it clearly hadn't been. And then in the end, he deducted $100, so it cost me $100, the fact that we ordered two of these things. And there was literally, Amazon said to me, there's pretty much nothing that you can do. You can do what you want here. That isn't the case in places like Great Britain and Western Europe. So what does the government do to set consumer rights? Consumer rights in terms of you as a purchaser of goods, you in terms of what happens if you happen to live next to a nuclear power station, what are they allowed to do? And that kind of creeps into the second part where we talk about environmental protection and so on. What does the government do? How does it set itself out? And then we also get the other thing, lots of governments write lots and lots of laws. I mean, the volume of laws coming out of some countries is just enormous, but nobody ever takes any notice of them. So what do they do then in terms of follow-up? What do they do in terms of actually regulating them and so on? Yeah. The final one that we've got there is restrictive practices. So what do they do as well to stop monopolies building up? What do they stop? What do they do to stop individual branches of the government as well taking over the organisation of things? So we've got this idea of the legal basis of what does the government do. Fiscal is the level of taxation. What do they tax? What's the rates of tax, and how brutal are they in actually collecting the tax? Again, some countries have tax collection rates of 30-35%. Others are closer to sort of 80%. So, what do they actually do about collecting their tax? Economic public expenditure. Right. So, public expenditure here we're looking at helping to either stimulate the economy or cool down the economy by raising or lowering public expenditure. Are they generally fiscally responsible? I think Britain now has 420% of GDP in the form of debt. So public expenditure, a huge part of public expenditure is quite simply paying off the interest on that debt. What's happening with public expenditure? Again, most countries that have a heavily involved government have heavily policed public expenditure. Exchange rates, do they let their currency float, or do they let it go with the wind? Again, most countries try to set up some sort of corridor and control it within the corridor. We saw with Russia when the war started in Ukraine that the ruble went from 30 to the dollar to 60 to the dollar fairly quickly. Then it kind of began to creep back. So what do they do with exchange rates? And the same with interest rates as well. Interest rates are a very heavily used tool to control the economy. Again, we saw this, to use Russia again as an example, because I know Russia, back in the early 2000s, we had the situation where house prices were rising at 2% a week, and so therefore what the government did is they whacked up the mortgage rates to something like 14 or 15%, so that people could no longer afford to just keep bidding for houses. So we had this idea that interest rates were being used to cool the housing market. Those interest rates have never really crept down either. So we've got legal, fiscal, economic, and then political. We're looking here at incentive schemes. So when you have tax-free zones, certain types of businesses, certain types of assets will will qualify for certain types of tax relief. So I think water cleanage for something in Britain at one time was tax free. Certain types of manufacturing assets, you'll get accelerated capital allowances, accelerated tax depreciation, and so on and so forth. Right, once again, this kind of stuff should be fairly obvious for you, or fairly easy to remember. Just try to remember your headings. What are we doing? We're giving ourselves some structure. And as ACCA becomes more global, this becomes more important as a topic. So this is something you should definitely know. So back to good old Michael Porter at the Harvard Business School again. Michael Porter here came up with 7 things that he said that this is the impact on the economy as a whole on certain businesses. If you remember Michael Porter, he was looking at rivalry in certain industries. So what do we specifically look at with an industry here? So we've got 7 here, and again, they're all fairly straightforward. Capacity expansion. Michael Porter is saying that the government can stimulate capacity expansion. It can do that by providing incentives, basically. So through your capacity expansion, therefore, what we're doing is that we're giving organizations the ability to grow their business, particularly production capacity. And it does that by providing tax breaks through depreciation, through government grants, and so on and so forth. Hand in hand with that is demand. The government itself can stimulate demand in certain industries by buying those goods itself. But the government in every country of the world requires pretty much everything. So therefore, in terms of that, therefore, the government will provide levels of demand. Divestment and exit. The government may enter into, is that the right phrase? A government may stop a business from divesting itself or exiting a certain business. We've seen this in the car industry. For example, the government of Spain sold off SEAT to Volkswagen, but there were very strict controls on what Volkswagen could do. And when Volkswagen talked about wanting to sort of get rid of a number of employees and so on, then the government kind of stepped in and said, no, you can't do that. We've seen the same thing in Sweden, where General Motors wanted to get rid of Saab, and so again, when that happened, the government stepped in and said, well, if somebody is going to buy it, they have to keep it alive. We're not going to let that just simply be sold off. We had the same with Volvo, which was up in Sweden as well. So it's this idea that when a business is being sold off, the government will step in and say, you can't sell it to those people, or you can't close it. Or if you are going to sell it to those people, there must be certain conditions in the sale agreement for us to allow that sale to go through. So it's this kind of idea that the government will interfere. It won't just stand by and watch. Emerging industries is very much the same as capacity expansion. Your government will highlight certain key industries, and within those key industries, it can assist with expansion, it can assist with growth, it can assist with demand, and so on. Obviously, all countries in the world want some form of IT technology in their own countries. I'm sitting here in Abu Dhabi. You drive through UAE, all over the place. There's, I forgot the names of all of them now, Microsoft and Google and so on have got offices here. What are we doing to push those industries? And also the thing that the government can do is it can build around them. So in other words, it can go to the universities and say, right, to continue with your university licenses, you have to turn out a certain number of IT engineers and so on. So it's building structure within a business line as well. Entry barriers, the government can set up entry barriers, they can set up tariffs, they can set up quotas, the government can do what it wants really. I mean, the problem with that is that they're obviously reciprocal. So if you turn around to the Chinese and say, right, you can only bring 10,000 motor cars into the country a year, then the Chinese are going to say, well, you can only bring 10,000 into our country as well. So we get this idea of entry barriers, but they will be reciprocal. And here also we have competition policy. So you'll find that the government may in itself step in and set certain rules, and those rules mean that what you're really looking in that sense is to stop monopolies coming into existence. So competition policy, we're stopping this idea of monopolies and stuff. You know, we're sort of seeing it at the moment, in that the government is telling people if you want licenses to provide things like satellite phones, you have to provide broadband internet connections to rural areas. What we also see, therefore, as someone who's just moved to a rural area in the very far north of England, is we see those companies trying to get round it. But in principle, EE and British Telecom and all of these people are supposed to provide fast internet to small villages in the middle of nowhere, and that's part of their license to have mobile phones and so on and so forth. Finally, new product adoption. The government can to some degree force companies to adopt new products. It can do that by changes in the legislation. I think is it California now, I'm sure someone will correct me if I'm wrong, but California, I believe, has a quota system, so 1 in 6 of every new car sold has to be sort of hybrid technology, and that's why we see the growth of hybrid technology down there in California. That's the kind of thing that the government can step in and do, and if car companies don't follow that, then we'll find that they're penalised and so on and so forth. So they will restrict the number of cars available or whatever, raise the prices or whatever. And the same thing goes with, water meters is one in Britain. Every new house now has to have a water meter. Right, that's Michael Porter. There's 7 things there. Again, something to learn, gives you a nice structure. Maybe you can remember some of it. Right, so our final slide here, so dealing with uncertainty. Right, so can you notice now that we're actually on page 99 of the textbook. Now, as a general rule, I would never advise students to read the textbook that goes with the course, just do the questions. So the only reason you read the textbook is if there's some particular part that you don't understand. Paper P5, I would almost recommend you to read the textbook. Certainly read the key parts of it. Firstly, it's actually quite an interesting read, compared to auditing or something. But secondly, there's some good stuff in there. Right, so there's a little table on page 99, and I've just listed the headings from that table here. So what we're doing now is how do we actually therefore plan for uncertainty? So the first thing is scenario planning. So we plan scenarios and work out different things that could happen. Now this is something that you see, for example, where I worked at fraud, is in the legal profession. Well, this is how it panned out, and this is how this person saw this opportunity, and so on and so forth. So we plan out scenarios. The problem with scenarios is that you have to dream up the scenarios, and they may not be the scenarios that other people would necessarily dream up. Much more common, much more useful as a tool, much more widely used then is computer simulation. So you have a number of variables, and you're interlinking variables, and your computer will link these things up for you. And in fact, computer simulation is just the modern day version of scenario planning. In the good old days before computers, people would come up and say, well, this happened and this happened. Now with the computer simulation, you can build models. The problem with models is that they never get human behavior right. But with computer simulation, you can link things in. Companies like Shell and BP, for example, Shell have an enormous modeling center, which is in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, I think, and therefore they do this, and they look at their market all over the world and what happens if, and they can do what happens if the weather gets worse, what happens if we have a revolution in Madagascar. Governments do this as well, not only for their internal economic planning, but also for their external, for their foreign affairs planning and so on. So scenario planning and computer simulation, realistically more or less the same thing. Sensitivity analysis is more or less what-if analysis, so therefore we plan that this will be the level of taxation. If this is the level of taxation, how much revenue do we earn? And then sensitivity analysis is, okay, well, how far wrong can we afford to be? What if we're 1%, 5%, 10%? And this is where your statisticians come in with your sensitivity analysis. So again, it's usually done as part of computer simulation, and you can have this, what if. I mean, we literally do and Excel will even do what if analysis for you. Expected values, therefore, is where you try to predict values. With the problem with doing predicted values is that you have to say, well, the oil price now is $60 a barrel. It could be $70 a barrel. There's a 20% probability of that, 80%, and there's a 12% probability of that, and so on and so forth. Again, with modern computers, you can do this, but again, it's not really that far away from sensitivity analysis. And once you start to factor all of the probabilities and so on in, the different levels of probability, from an exam point of view, it becomes very, very messy. You can very quickly go to 10,000 possible outcomes with only 3 or 4 different decision variables. once you're doing it in an office with a computer, obviously much easier to do. So those are the first four, and really they're all just variations on scenario planning. The final one, I do recommend that you have a look at page 99 and have a little bit of a read about this. I told you at the start, there was the old management accounting paper, and this was a popular topic in the old management accounting paper. What you basically do here is that you have a choice of outcomes. So you're going to sell a motor car. You can sell it either for $25,000, $30,000, or $35,000. You've got those three choices. From those three choices, therefore, we're then going to make some calculations. So, and then the question is, which one do we pick from those three? So do we pick the one that maximizes our total possible revenue? Do we pick the one that maximizes our total probable revenue, or do we one that gives us the worst, the best worst case scenario? So if we sell the minimum number of units we expect, which one will give us the minimum loss? So which one gives us the maximum possible overall? Which one gives us the most likely profit? And which one gives us the least loss possible? And that's what you're doing with those three. You have to do the calculations across the different levels of revenue that you will earn at different prices with different levels of probability, and you'll be given a table. It's a fairly routine, mundane arithmetic exercise, but have a look at how to do it. I don't think it's very likely for your exam, but have a look at page 99 and you'll see how to do it there. But it's a bit different from the other ones above. The others are just scenario planning in various forms. Okay, you should know what those things are. They're fairly much common sense. If it's going to come up, it's going to be 5 or 10 marks, and you can write a couple of things about 3 of them to get 6 in case of. Okay, that's part 1. We've done the introduction. Now what's happened is we've been a little bit all over the place when we've done this, which is Mendelow, and we've done this, which is Porter. But what you've got now is you've got some tools, and what you can do with those tools is now you can start to look at actually answering some questions. And that really is the point you need to be at, because you just need to do as many questions as possible to learn the approach to this. Okay, so the first question that you've got there is called the X group. From memory, this question was an exam question in the old strategy paper in about 1999. For those of you who come from Great Britain or have any relationship with Great Britain will remember that this is based on the Virgin Group, though I don't think that's official, but your examiner here at that time obviously has based it on that. Right, what you should do now is you should turn me off and you should read the question. Please can you study it in this way, or I recommend you study it in this way, is that you just read the question. Don't worry, normally they tell you to read the required section first and then read the whole question, bearing in mind that you're under less time pressure in this exam than certain other exams. I would literally start at line number 1 and read the whole question right the way through. What we particularly want you to understand, or I particularly want you to understand, is what is the style of the question. Because what I want you to note from this is it just literally is like the examiner has plucked clumps of information and stuck them together. There is no thread of this, you have this heap of information, and your job is going to be to try and make some sense of it and to pull a story from it. So you're trying to pull some sort of believable story out of all of this. And that's not that easy. And your first question will always be, Jesus, what is it that they actually want me to do? What do they want me to do? And that is the question, and never really been fully answered, but that's why we get this idea of structure. So when you look at the slides here, you'll see that it says structure, structure, structure. So turn me off. I will now be quiet for 4 or 5 seconds and then I'll start talking again, but you should stop me and then read the question. Don't do any underlining, any planning or anything like that. Just read the question, that's all. Just get a feel for the information that's there. If I can keep going now, this is going to get exactly to 2 minutes. And while we do that, in fact, it's just gone over. I think that I will go and do battle with the air conditioner, which I can't seem to turn off. Right. Okay, I think that is something like 5 seconds, so let's start to talk now. Right, have a look at part A, and it would help if I had the question in front of me, wouldn't it? Let's have a look and see what part A actually asks you. it asks you to talk about the competitive environment in which this company is operating. I think I looked at this, and when I first started this, I jotted down a number of possible approaches to this, because you remember at the start, it doesn't tell you what to use, so you can in principle use any one of various models. Certainly the one that jumped off the page at me was Porter, and I think it's because when you look at the actual wording of it, he's talking about the external forces. Now the other one, which I always am a big fan of, and I haven't included in the notes anywhere, is SWOT. So remember SWOT, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats. So SWOT analysis is a good one as well. The problem with these things is you have to read all of this, because if you use a model at part A, I don't think you can really use it again at part B. You're trying to double up on the points again. So therefore I went with Porter. So therefore, and that was what the examiner went with as well. So go back to the slides on Porter. If you're on the website, if you go onto my website, which is mefielding.com, on the website you can go in there and then you can download the actual slides in their original PowerPoint form. So have a look at the slides there, and you'll see Porter, list out Porter, and then just give yourself 2 minutes, but do the discipline. Write out the 5 things, and then next to it write a couple of points, because then in the exam you've got all your ideas down on paper. So have a go at that, and then I will click on to the next. So, as I said, you had to come up with some sort of model. You could also have taken the list of stakeholders and looked at the stakeholders and just taken out the external one. So the shareholders would, to some degree, you could have argued were external. Certainly the government would have had a say here, and I think you would have got good points for that as well. But the ones I've got here are Porter, and those are the ones that the examiner used. In general, when we're talking about these things, therefore, you'd be looking at Porter if you're looking at competition. So barriers to entry in the airline industry and barriers to entry in the rail industry are both extremely high. In the rail industry, you have to get a license from the government. It says somewhere in the question they've got a license and it runs for another 5 years. So the barriers to entry of someone else coming into your business are extremely high in terms of the rail business. In terms of the airline industry, well, what can happen therefore is that people can compete for slots. So in other words, airlines they'll have a certain number of aeroplanes that can land at 9 o'clock in the morning, and so on and so forth. So therefore, your barriers to entry there are not so high, because your barriers to entry here will be other companies moving into, excuse me, moving into your time slots. So the barriers to entry there exist. The company, as I remember from the question, certainly it's called certainly it's called PLC somewhere in the question, I believe, as I remember. So it's British, so you've got British Airways in competition to you there, and others as well, Ryanair and so on in our part of the world. So the barriers to entry therefore are significant. So therefore you've got a much higher level of confidence. This is the point when you go to draw from this. If we're comparing the two, and it does say here that P faces in its worldwide business. So therefore significant barriers to entry means that you have to meet significant quality and price standards. High amount of rivalry, high amount of competition there. Substitutes, remember we're looking at the worldwide business according to the question. So the substitutes therefore, there's not so very many particular substitutes in the sense of other modes of transport. If you're flying from London to Sydney, it starts to become tough if you think, well, I can fly or I can drive or I can go on a boat. Certainly you can go on a ship and cruise around the world, but if you do that, it's going to take you, I don't even know what it takes, a month, 6 weeks or something like that. If you're going by car, you just simply wouldn't make it. So there's no substitutes in the sense of alternative modes of transport. What you have got, of course, substitutes is rivals. So if you want to fly from London to Sydney, you've got Qantas and Garuda and so on. So therefore, substitutes exist. So again, in the worldwide business, there's a high level of rivalry. Suppliers, your biggest problem with your suppliers will be your oil. I don't know that much about the air industry, I'm not going to pretend to you, but in terms of suppliers of aircraft parts and so on and so forth, you're not looking at so very much, I wouldn't think. But here, if we're looking at suppliers, if you're looking at suppliers in terms of oil prices will be dictated to you by the worldwide oil price. And so therefore, in that sense, they have significant power, because they will dictate to you what the price is. If you don't want to pay it, then you're very limited in where it is that you're actually going to go to. Buyers again have a significant amount of power, because with your buyers, what's going to happen is that if they don't like your airline because they have a bad experience, and there's all these things like Yelp and so on, where you get to rate people, Amazon and so on, then what will happen is that they'll just move to another airline. So therefore, in that sense, you're in this odd situation where it's almost like a fast-moving consumer good, where both the suppliers and the buyers have significant power over you, which is really, really not good. Rivalry is absolutely cutthroat. You've got to remember as well that you've got rivalry in terms of the number of people coming into this market. Many of the companies which you are competing with will be government sponsored. Even within Europe, there are claims that Air France and so on are government sponsored by the French government. Certainly there have been numerous legal cases recently where Etihad and Emirates have been called up by the Americans because they say that the Emirati government is supporting them. And so you've got this idea where you're in rivalry with organisations that have basically unlimited sums of money to spend. In addition to that, in terms of information, one of the great things that the internet has brought to us is this wealth of information, and there are comparability sites on everything now. If you want to buy an air ticket, the one I use is called Cheapo Air, and it will come back. If I want to fly from New York to the Emirates, it will come back with 50 different ways in which I can do it, based on how much money I want to spend, which airline I want to use, and how many times I'm willing to stop over in Bucharest or Budapest or Amsterdam or wherever. So therefore, in terms of answering the first question, you've got your 5 things there. What is the importance of those external forces? Every single one of them is important to you. Barriers to entry are considerable, substitutes are considerable, suppliers have power over you, rivals have power over you, and the rivalry in the industry because of all of this, the information and so on, is absolutely brutal. So it's not a good industry to be in. Warren Buffett actually said there's an easy way to end up with $1 billion. Let's just start with $2 billion and open an airline. And it's not really a great business. Part B was loosely based around ratio analysis. Ratio analysis is the single most examined topic at ACCA, even more than ethics, which is supposed to be the most popular topic. And once again, it was an absolute godsend to students who were determined to fail. You were given 15 marks here, and obviously, therefore, what someone who wanted to fail would do would just go through the question and list all the parts out of it. Now remember your exam setting, this is kind of what we've already telling you to do in other parts of the question, so you're thinking, Jesus, what do I do here? When you've got this thing here with reference to the comparative financial and other performance indicators, so go through the question. Remember this thing's structure, this is why you're choosing structure, so that you always know what it is that you've got coming up and what it is that you've got to do. So choose 4, 5, 6 things here. If you're doing some sort of a calculation, there will usually be 1 mark for the calculation. Then you've got to comment, and it's the very final level of ACCA, so they're expecting something meaningful, not just it's gone up by 2 days for debtors recovery or something. And then some further comment. I've written here remedial action. It might be good. Excuse me, it might be good. Who knows? But some meaningful comment. You are looking for structure. So this is the part where I actually chose to use SWOT analysis here. SWOT analysis is everyone's favourite, but feel free to use it because it's used in real life. Perfectly valid that it is. So now go on and do strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats. You got 15 marks, so you're looking for a couple of things under each one, which you can then talk about and which you can then develop. Right, away you go. I would do SWOT analysis. I think this is set up for SWOT. If you want to do something else, that's absolutely fine. But give it some form of structure and some form of identifiable structure so that when the marker looks at it, he knows what he's done. So I started off with the strengths. When you look at the question, so you're looking for a couple of good things. So if I just flick the question over, you can see therefore that airlines turnover has gone up, airlines pre-tax profit has gone up by exactly a third, rail has also increased by not by very much, and the rail's pre-tax profit has also increased. So we've got a couple of things there. For saying, identifying that there's growth in profits, for identifying that there's growth in turnover, you want to say those things, and then you want to make some comment as well. So with the airlines, we've got, I haven't done the numbers, but you've got some sort of 20% increase or something, 20% increase year on year, looks very good. And if you then compare that to the capital employed, we've had much greater growth in turnover and profit than we have had an increase in capital. And if you compare it to the rail, therefore you'll see that the rail has had a much greater increase in capital compared to those growth industries. So the business therefore needs to look at what it's doing and say, well, where does it want to focus its efforts? Either airlines is a much more potentially profitable industry, or there are weaknesses in the rail and we can address the rail, whichever way the company itself wants to go. Right, so you've got your strengths, your weaknesses. Therefore, we focused on rail here, so we've got decline in the number of passengers, decline in the staff to passenger ratios. So the number of train passengers, therefore, you would expect to see that revenue would fall, but in fact it hasn't. So presumably there have been marked amounts of price increases as well. We can conclude from that we need to get those passage numbers up. But it doesn't give you any information about utilisation, but the implication therefore is you've got empty seats. So they need some marketing campaign to get people back onto the train. Decrease in staff to passenger ratios. The overall strategy, it tells you at the start of the question, has been to push on in terms of identifying where there's poor quality service and increasing on those levels of service. They need to be careful, therefore, that they're not going to become themselves just a run-of-the-mill ordinary company. And in fact, assuming that this is Virgin, that's exactly what has happened. Their reputation has taken an absolute tanking with those trains. Okay, there's your strengths and weaknesses. That is just 4. Please don't think that is in any way a correct answer. It's just 4 things that I think are valid. If you've got other things, then I'm sure your things are just as valid. So opportunities that they've got now. Well, a couple of things here. I mean, now you're just guessing, really, aren't you? But based on what you know from their businesses, you're looking for a couple of things here. I didn't even pick anything direct out of the question, which are opportunities for them. So I've got the holiday industry. You know, my parents live way up in Scotland, so if they want to go to India or Australia or somewhere, they could get them by train down to London and then fly them. So you've got this idea of organising package tours. So going into every single part of the processing chain. So the holiday industry, an alternative might also be freight services. So if you've got international freight, you can load it on at a train station. It goes by train to the airport and then flies aboard as well. I have no idea whether Virgin do these things. I do believe that they do holidays. I'm not sure about freight. These are just examples of opportunities that I see, and once again, you may see different opportunities. Your answers are just as good as mine, as long as they are logical and sensible. Threats. Oil prices. If you are running diesel trains, then they are dependent on oil prices, and if you are running aircraft, they are most definitely dependent on oil prices. So rises in oil prices are threats to this company on both sides. And the second one is that customer dissatisfaction spreads. I don't know how Virgin Airlines does. I've flown Virgin Airlines. I can't say I was monstrously over-impressed with them, but I wasn't monstrously under-impressed. I didn't lose my luggage or poison me or anything, which numerous other airlines have done, or tell me that they've given my seat to someone else. Seems to be a common one with airlines. I have that kind of face that makes them not want me to go on another aircraft. But if you get low levels of customer satisfaction, so here we've got customer dissatisfaction, you're going to get this idea of like brand poisoning. So therefore, where Virgin has gone from, and it was known for being very kind of upbeat and something a bit different, if it becomes just a run-of-the-mill company that has crap customer service, then that dissatisfaction can spread, and it will spread across to other brands as well. They've already had some business failures. Their record business closed down because of online music and so on. So Virgin have had their issues. Right, for part B, therefore, what the question actually asked you was, let's just go back and make sure we've answered the question. So recommend ways in which they can increase their individual contributions. Right, you've probably just about got enough to pass if you've identified 8 different things like this. So how could they actually pick these things up? Well, their revenue is going, so they need to keep increasing revenue more. Yeah? So airlines needs to keep growing the way that it is, and rail needs to have some turnaround to increase its utilization. In terms of its weaknesses, therefore, we're coming back to the same ideas of full-up utilization. Certainly, indication of value with reference to recommend ways. So in the first half we've got the marks for the second way, so therefore we can addressing those weaknesses. Up here with our opportunities we can launch Virgin holidays and freight services if that's still possible. I don't know what the maximum is in terms of pulling trains and whether it's even feasible to carry goods and passengers at the same time. You may not be even allowed to do that. But certainly, and therefore in terms of adjusting our threats of buying oil forward and working on areas where there is very high customer dissatisfaction to bring back the brand loyalty and to increase the sales of our organisation. I think in terms of getting 50%, as long as you had a good structure, that was easy. Going much over 50% is hard. It's difficult to really look in that question and pick out obvious areas that they can really hit to increase. One area which is given there is where it says future development for environmental accounting. So becoming a sustainability leader within those two industries may help them as well. And that might have been something good to put in your answer as well. Right, this was a typical nightmare of a question from actually the previous examiner, because he set you this, and just looking at the question, and we're talking about part C now, which is on the slide, as you can obviously see there. Explain the main factors which have contributed to P's commercial success so far, and comment on the chairman's personal responsibilities. And this was 10 marks, and of course students in the real exam just had no idea whatsoever to write for this. Right, there is a way to approach this, and the way to approach it therefore is to go through the question and just lift out of the question everything that relates to this. So this is a highlighted pen job. The only thing is that when you do that, please make sure that you stay on track and don't just drift off and off and off, because we get people writing the most amazing things of all when you're marking mock exams or even real exams as well, actually. And then finally ask for some comment, and they actually give you the four main drivers. So then you try to get these buzzwords in as well, stakeholders, Mendelow and stakeholders. So now planning is of the essence, because otherwise it is just we're back to this idea of the structureless lump. So once you've got your highlighter pen going out, and I just took 5 minutes to do this, but please make a plan. Write these down, and then when you write them down, you've got to talk about them, because you need to not just list them from the question, but you need to make some comment on them. And so that's what the slide means therefore. So make a plan, make a plan, make a plan, make a plan. Right, well, we go through them. So we start talking about the brand, about building reputation, and about stretching. So stretching is this idea of getting the brand to go across various business ideas. And bear in mind that he used to make records, and then he owned record shops, and then he moved into trains, and then he moved into airlines and so on. So Richard Branson as an individual has been everywhere, and he's done his transatlantic balloon crashes and stuff like that. Right, so the first thing to say therefore is explain the main factors which have contributed. So we've built this brand. He has differentiated his brand. So in other words, when you think of Virgin, you do think that Virgin is different from other record shops. And then having taken that association, we apply it to everything else. It's like me, I stand up and I can usually teach stuff in a really entertaining fashion. So people then automatically assume that everything else I do in my job I'm really great at as well. But not necessarily true. There are certain people around the world who've tried that and have now decided that that is not true at all. So we get this association that because they're good at this, they must be good at everything else. The reality being that they're not. So one thing which has really helped them is this ability to take the brand. Right, the second thing is value. He says that he's always looked to add value. So therefore throughout the process, or if not throughout the process, most of the time, he's been able to add value, or certainly give the impression that he's adding value. It's difficult when you look at that to see how this is true within the railway industry, where we seem to be investing vast sums of money, getting very little return, and people are falling off the train. People are falling off the wagon. Yeah. So we've got this idea, therefore, of value. Number 3 is the consumer's champion, and we really have seen a change in attitude of companies to their customers since the 1970s. We'll talk about quality later in the course, but they built up this idea that they champion the consumer, and the consumer is always right. And that obviously draws people back to them. And certainly it's true for me when I'm in Britain. I buy a lot of stuff off of Amazon because I know that if I buy stuff off of Amazon, even if I just don't like it, I can send it back and I'll get my money back as long as I'm reasonable in taking care of it and wrapping it up. And that is not true in other shops. I bought a television once as a present for my parents. I took it home and my father says, "Oh, we can't have it because we don't have the right connections for the right type of box for it." So we took it back, and the women in the shop basically accused me. And there was a part, there was a part missing as well. So we took it back, and the woman started complaining. And I said, "Well, look, there's a part missing, so it's incomplete." And she just basically accused me of throwing it away, so we could bring it back. I mean, when the person who's selling you goods starts accusing you of being a criminal, you start thinking, "I'm not going to come back here. I'll pay the extra to go somewhere else." So we get this idea of the consumer's champion, and the idea that buying things you can take it back, or buying things and it will be good quality service, does stick with you. Talented staff, it says somewhere in the question that he has talented staff and he promotes talented staff, which is good. And presumably we've got here the chairman, this kind of laid back, funky idea, presumably attracts younger talented people who grow, so that's there as well. And finally, communication. They communicate very well with their stakeholders, so the government, the public, the shareholders. Right, so you've got your 6 things there, and I think you've got enough marks to pass if you've got those things. But you need to say that, well, this has helped and this has helped, and why it's helped. Yeah. Finally, it does particularly ask you to comment on his personal responsibilities to the shareholders. Well, his personal responsibilities to the shareholders is to increase shareholder value. It certainly looks as if he's done that. The shares have gone up over the years. The employees, well, as far as the employees are concerned, presumably he creates as consumer champion and retaining talented staff, he creates a motivational atmosphere for them. For joint venture partners, I mean, he brings his brand with him, he brings his enthusiasm, he brings his knowledge with him. So his responsibility is to ensure that continues. And finally, the customers is to treat the customers the way that he always has done, which is well and as a valued part of the value chain. Okay. That sounds awfully woolly, awfully wishy-washy, but that's what the guy's looking for. You're not going to get things to hang your hat on the same way that you are in tax, for example. Okay, part D talked about environmental management accounting, and what I'm going to come on to and do now is to teach you environmental management accounting because you haven't been taught this previously. Just to say that there are actually a number of articles on performance management, environmental accounting, and other related topics which are up on the ACCA website. So go to ACCA website and look at the articles. You're at level P, you should know this. I shouldn't be telling you all of this now. But go have a look at those articles, and again, particularly ones which are written by the examiner, and then on the basis of that, please revise them for the exams. The article on environmental accounting is here, and I'll put a link on the website as well. So if you go on the website, you'll see the links right there. Right, let's be blunt about this. If you got this in the exam, you could have had a damn good go at guessing what this is, and you wouldn't really have been far wrong. Environmental management accounting is the implementation and introduction into management accounting of environmental factors. So that's what it says in the slide. I lifted this straight from some articles somewhere. So EMA changes the reasons why companies engage in pollution prevention activities. What you're basically doing is that you're applying a cost to environmental issues. So if you're going to wipe out a few million hectares of trees or something, you will apply a value to that, and you use that value as a cost in your internal management accounting. The reason for it we'll come on to in a second, but the point of it really is to say it's not just all because we're nice people and we're good people, so we shouldn't be wiping down areas the size of Wales every year in terms of rainforest. It's because we're saying that there is a genuine financial cost attached to it. So we're putting a genuine financial cost on these things. And it's actually very, very sensible. I mean, I think we all say that we support environmental issues, but there's always this thing, well, if I don't cut down these trees, someone else will come and do it anyway. So who really wants to be first? And then they'll take the money and so on and so forth. The point is that killing off the environment isn't just a moral question, it is actually an economic question as well. 75% of the world's marine life has disappeared in the last 40 years. Right, that is one incredibly sad, certainly particularly for those of us like me who have children and like our children to know what fish are. But it also has huge economic issues, because what the bloody hell happens when all the fish have gone? How are we going to feed all the people in the world? Economically, it is cheaper to start protecting stocks of fish and having quotas and limiting the number that we're killing than just wiping the damn things out. And it works all the same now. We've seen these things in so many poor countries. They cut down the trees, and then after they cut down the trees, there's a landslide and 10,000 people die, and then we end up giving them a couple of $200 or $300 million to clean up their land, and it would have been incredibly cheaper in the first place if we just stepped in and bought the land and kept the trees alive. It would have been better for the people and better for everyone involved. So that's what environmental management accounting does. It seeks to take this common sense approach and say it's better to buy the land and do nothing with it than it is to allow you to cut down the trees, because ultimately it will be cheaper. And so we're applying values to these things. As you know, organisations like the United Nations through UN Ops with their sustainable procurement and so on lead the way on these things. It is becoming more than socially acceptable. It is now becoming a financial requirement, and shareholders and governments are putting pressure on people, and it will grow, because if it doesn't, there's just going to be nothing left. So it has to grow as these things become more and more scarce. Okay, so the slide is actually fairly self-explanatory. What we're looking at here is a kind of cost classification system for these environmental costs. So we split them into 4 groups. Right, once again, remembering that the whole aim of this course is to learn from me all these different classifications and things that you can use in the exam. So try and remember these things. Right, the first thing that we have is prevention costs. So, and you've seen these, and this is straight from management accounting. So prevention is we're trying to reduce the amount of money that we have to spend to prevent the production of waste. So all of the money that you have, which is spent on cleaning up, putting filters in, finding out what we're going to do with spent mercury, spent radioactive stuff. I used to work with a company that had used radioactive elements in cleaning, in sterilization processes. So what do we do with those? So prevention costs is our first group of costs that we're trying to get down, which is activities to prevent the production of the waste. Detection costs, as the name suggests, costs that we have in processes which will detect these items. Internal failure costs are what are the costs that happen within our business when things go wrong and we have these environmental disasters. So what happens to us internally. And then external is costs including activities performed after discharging the waste into the environment. So your internal failure costs are when you have certain processes which are designed to clean up on a sort of permanent basis inside your company. And then external failure costs are once the waste is gone, so you've given it to the disposal company or whatever, what are the costs that actually happen there? But I think that's all actually fairly straightforward. What you need to be able to do is to remember those 4 things and then say what they are and give examples as well. So cost of activities undertaken to prevent the production of waste, of damaging waste. So these are certain procedures that you will have inside of your company. You need to ensure, so environmental detection costs stand to this is where you have your whole quality standards department. Environmental internal failure costs, so this is where we have costs, cleanup costs inside our own company before anyone else finds out exactly what's happened. And then external is external cleanup costs, and this is what you see on the news when things go wrong. I actually think you might want to spend a couple of minutes looking at that slide, because I think it's in your head, it's easy. But getting it down on paper in a way that explains it well is actually quite hard. So slide number 16 shows you a second classification, if you like, which is a little bit broader. So we've got 4 different things here: conventional costs, contingent costs, relationship, and reputational costs. Right, convention costs are your conventional cleanup costs. So if you have the oil industry, these will be those costs which are in terms of sealing tanks, cleaning up earth, and so on and so forth. So the stuff that you conventionally spend, your day-to-day spend. Contingent costs, I think, certainly the way I looked at this when I read this in some of the sort of academic papers, is there's two types of contingent costs. One is contingent costs which you know you're going to have to spend. So those would, that qualifies as contingent. So those would be expenses such as cleanup costs when an oil well runs dry. So you drill a hole in the ground, you get some coal and some oil and some gas out of it in Scotland, and then when it's finished you have to put the land back. Now that will be part of you granting a license, and that's everyday business now in every country around the world. So it's a contingent liability in the future, but it's contingent on something that you know is going to happen. The second type would be contingent costs which you don't know. So this is those kind of costs that you insure against. So you're drilling underground, oil comes out, some of it spills into the local river and kills wildlife. That would be contingent costs. So it's this idea of costs that you don't know that are going to happen but might. Again, I would look at it as the sort of thing that you would insure against with your car or something like that in real life. Relationship and reputational costs are costs, both of which are related to your reputation. Reputational costs are things like, so reputational costs, the fourth one, are things like when you flood a river and then they show on TV pictures of all the birds having all of their feathers cleaned up and so on. Relationship costs are kind of the same as your reputation. But I think here it's the slight difference is here you're dealing with suppliers and customers. If you have a company which is ISO 9000, and so therefore it's a certain quality standard, and then there are issues about your environmentalism, about how good you are environmentally, whether you think it's perfectly okay to pump mercury into the local river, as one of our clients used to do, that company won't deal with you. Now that would be a relationship cost. You're someone in your production chain, someone in that production process won't deal with you because you don't meet their standards, be they environmental standards, be they quality standards, be they moral standards, whatever it is that they set. And that to me is a relationship cost, because it's a business to business relationship, and you're not in it, and you're not in it because you're not good enough. Reputational costs, very, very similar, but I split that out when I wrote my notes for this in terms of customers. So therefore, people who own cars will not buy petrol from BP because BP have just flooded the local river and wiped out all the otters or swans or whatever that lived in there. So I put this difference between your business partners who won't deal with you because they have standards that you don't meet. And reputational cost is customers who won't buy from you because your reputation is not good enough. That's how I would split them out, and that kind of makes sense to me, and that fits most of the definitions that you read when you read articles on this. In terms of techniques which can be used and applied, therefore, to this environmental management accounting, again, this is pretty much common sense. Any technique that you've got which is based around costing, it just becomes an extra cost. So for ABC, if it is various levels of cost and they can be very accurately applied, then we can use ABC. ABC is activity-based costing. If you don't know what it is, you need to go back and look at your previous notes. Input-output analysis is looking at the cost of what goes in and what comes out of processes. For those of you who did the old paper 3 or whatever the basic management accounting paper is called these days, you're looking at process costing. So as part of your process costing, you're adding these environmental costs into process costing. And flow cost is the same. Usually the slight difference between process costing and flow costing is that in flow costing, materials are by far the largest part of your cost, and you may not add overheads. That may screw up your whole costing system now, because these are overheads that will be material in their cost. And finally, life cycle accounting. Life cycle accounting is when you take the total cost of the product over its life cycle. So this would be products usually that have big development costs or launch costs. So therefore, with development costs, you would be looking at something like a new drug, and with launch costs, you might be looking at fast-moving consumer goods, or everyone's favourite now, of course, mobile phones. The point with this is that basically any costing system that you have, this is just an extra cost to put in. With things which are material based, the old thing that used to be called throughput accounting, for example, then it may cause you problems as to whether your whole costing system is relevant or not. So the question asked, it's only 4 marks, I think, but why is it important? You can take anything here. I think it was just 4 marks, and what you're looking for, 2 to 4 points. But I just said here for cost minimization, so conventional cost, this idea, therefore, that in terms of we need to know an accurate picture of what our costs are so we can minimize them, those being our conventional costs. Certainly airlines are seen very much as a bit of an environmental nightmare. Contingency costs, so that we don't spill aircraft fuel, so that we disposal of waste from airplanes is a good one as well. In the good old days, the toilet used to go straight out into the air, but obviously doesn't now. So are your contingent costs, to make sure you're aware of what those costs are and where they could arise. Your relationship costs, where you have suppliers, customers, and so on, and your reputational costs. Certainly you can use this thing as product leaders and so on. So for part 1, I think that was fairly straightforward, and you're just applying common sense will give you 4 points. You should be aware as to why we can justify this environmental accounting as well, and it's more than just because you want our kids to know what a penguin looks like in real life. And finally, Esther. Right, so part D of the question. So how can we actually use this in the organisation? Where can we actually see it? Well, cost calculations, they will calculate costs, and there's nothing to stop you including these things. So therefore you calculate what is the cost of them, and they are to make sure that they are included in costs. Right, where do we use our costs? Well, we use our costs in financial reporting. Certainly if you're going to try and, if you look at the bottom of this list, if you're going to try and use this thing to show that you are go ahead and a step ahead of the game and you are, environmentally friendly and aware, then having an environmental report and showing that we're trying to limit the damage, particularly that our aeroplanes cost, is a good way to go with financial reporting as well. It should also be included in project appraisal, so therefore if you are looking at leasing more aircraft, if you're looking at buying some more trains, laying down some more tracks, whatever they're looking at doing, you can include these costs in project appraisal, and that takes them forward in project costing. We can include them in staff appraisals and recruitment where they're relevant, but certainly in terms of recruitment, if we're looking for talented individuals, we should be looking for talented individuals who are motivated to undertake this. It's environmental management accounting. Gosh, how can that ever be relevant in recruitment? But we can talk to people about it and find out what they are and whether they're keen and whether they're motivated. Procurement, so we use it in procurement when we're looking at what is the true cost of the goods that we're buying. We talked about this idea of the relationship. We should be building up, therefore, suppliers who are as committed to the environment as we are. And if they're not, we can add cost to their bids, and so making them less economically viable. Advertising, so here we're talking about not only, obviously we're going to do this to make sure that we're actually doing it in terms of limiting our costs, in terms of measuring our costs and reducing our carbon footprint and so on. We can use that in our advertising. So in our advertising, therefore, it gives us hopefully revenue gains which will offset the costs. And finally, in promotion, and I put the word sponsorship there because I wanted this to work the other way. When we look at sponsoring organisations, and Virgin Trains actually sponsor my football club. When we look at organisations that we're going to sponsor, we should be looking at sponsoring and giving to organisations which are environmentally aware, active, and doing the right things as well as just saying it. Okay, that was part 2 to risk and uncertainty, which was part 1. That was a long session, but it was really good. It was really good. Thank you, Mark. But I thought it was really good because you now got a whole bunch of tools. You've seen a question. You've seen how to approach a question, and I hopefully have shown you how to use the tools to give structure, and then use your own common sense to apply to that structure, which will get you the 51% you need to get through this exam and be qualified. Best of luck, guys. You know where to find us.